Hey guys, it's Mitch. How's it going? We're taking a look today at Miracleman #1 by Alan Moore and Gary Leach. This was written at a time when Alan Moore hadn't been in comics for very long, but it kind of served notice as to what sort of comics Alan Moore valued and what he wanted to accomplish with comics. So before we get into it, let's start a little bit with the history, because the history with this is messy. So Miracleman starts in the 50s, actually, as Marvelman, which was basically a ripoff of Captain Marvel, the Fawcett character. Because the original publisher, L. Miller and Son, had been getting by on reprinting Captain Marvel strips that they were licensing from the publisher of Captain Marvel, Fawcett Publications. However, DC Comics took legal action on Fawcett, prompting them to stop publishing, which meant that the license that L. Miller and Son had with Fawcett was no longer valid. So they had to come up with something to fill the gap, and what they came up with was essentially off-brand Captain Marvel. So that was Marvelman. And Marvelman was extremely similar to Captain Marvel. He had the same kind of powers, he had the same deal going, where he was a kid, and when he said a magic word, he turned into a superhero, and he had very similar kinds of adventures. And Marvelman did all right for L. Miller and Son for most of the 50s. It actually did better than reprinting Captain Marvel did for him previously. The problem was that prior to the end of the 50s, the UK had a ban on American comics. And then that ban got lifted. All of a sudden, there was a whole lot more competition on the racks. And L. Miller and Son and Marvelman kind of got left in the dust. And the dust was where Marvelman stayed for about 20 years. Until about 1982, when an ex-Marvel UK editor named Des Skin decided he wanted to put out a creator-owned anthology book titled Warrior Magazine. And one of the first things he wanted to put in Warrior Magazine was Marvelman, because he'd read all sorts of Marvelman comics when he was a kid, and he loved the character. I'm having difficulty figuring out exactly how Des Skin got the rights to Marvelman, or how he at least thought he got the rights, because it appears to be kind of murky. But regardless, he was confident enough to put that first Marvelman story in Warrior #1. And for that story, he had a couple of writers that he had in mind. One was a guy named Steve Parkhouse, another was a guy named Steve Moore. If you've listened to interviews with Rob Liefeld about his dealings with Alan Moore when he was working at Awesome, this was the Steve Moore that got brought up in those interviews, that Alan Moore tried to pawn off on Liefeld to write stories for him. So anyway, Steve Moore didn't want to write Marvelman, but he had a buddy named Alan, no relation, who, once he heard about the Marvelman thing, was chomping at the bit to try and take a stab at it, because he'd also read Marvelman comics when he was a kid, and he had ideas about what he wanted to do with the comic. So he put together a pitch for Des Skin that was apparently extremely impressive, and explored a lot of the themes that Alan Moore would later go on to explore in things like Watchmen, where it was taking sort of a meta look at superheroes and examining them under a magnifying glass, and seeing how superheroes would impact modern day, but like from a realistic standpoint. So the first installment of Marvelman did end up in Warrior #1 as a 6-page entry. And that first issue of Warrior does seem to be kind of a holy grail for UK comics. There's all sorts of creators on there. In addition to featuring the first appearance of Marvelman, it also features the first installment of one of Alan Moore's other creations from around that time, which was V for Vendetta. It also has other early work from Steve Dillon, from Dave Gibbons, and John Bolton. So a lot of quality creators on that book. And Warrior managed to publish for a couple of years, but it always had financial problems. And eventually it did have to close up shop at issue 26. So cut to some more murky ownership bullshit, where theoretically a deal was struck with PC Comics that they would reprint the Warrior strips, but then PC went under and their assets were acquired by Eclipse Comics. Meanwhile, Des Skin seemed to have been under the impression that Alan Moore and Alan Davis somehow had ownership rights in that. It's a mess, man. Regardless, Eclipse eventually ended up with the rights, although it seems to have been kind of on shaky ground. So to try and avoid any kind of legal entanglements, they renamed the book Miracleman, which was one of the original names that the original creator was throwing around back when they were first coming up with their off-brand Captain Marvel. So the Eclipse run collected and reprinted the Marvelman strips that were originally published in Warrior, only now in color, because UK comics at that time weren't usually printed in color. And once they ran out of issues to reprint, they were able to get Alan Moore to finish the story. I think this would have been around the time that Alan Moore was working on Swamp Thing, so he brought in some of his collaborators in Rick Veitch and John Totleben for that. So anyway, that leads us up to issue 1 here. There's all sorts of ownership problems with Marvelman and Miracleman ensuing after this, but we won't worry about those in this video. So we got our brand new cover here by Gary Leach. It's interesting because at the time this was published, Gary Leach didn't really have any kind of link to the character anymore, except for some kind of tenuous ownership hold. But Eclipse commissioned him to provide covers, at least for all of the issues that he provided interiors for. And it's a really nice cover. Some very dramatic lighting going on. Doesn't feel like the kind of superhero that would have been going around in 1985 or 1982 for that matter. Although British comics were obviously very different from American comics at that time. And you can see Gary Leach's design for Miracleman is basically just like a somewhat muscular guy in a very tight suit. He was going for kind of a lean look, even though the original Marvelman, I think he was more along the lines of a Captain Marvel Muscle Man type of prototype. But yeah, great look, and, more than a little meticulous, which is something that would kind of get Gary Leach in trouble with Alan Moore later on. All right, so we're going to start things off with basically a reworked version of one of the old Marvelman stories from the 50s. I assume this is stuff that hasn't been directly reprinted, as that could cause rights issues, so I think this was probably redrawn by Gary Leach. I know Alan Moore reworked the dialogue a little bit at least, and then added in a final page at the end. Now, this is going to be an adventure with the original versions of Marvelman, Kid Marvelman, and Young Marvelman. This is the first installment that would have shown up in Warrior number 1, where the Marvelman family, again retitled the Miracleman family, would have faced off against the Science Gestapo from the future, the far-flung future of 1981. So this is a fun little story in which, future evildoers essentially travel back in time to 1956, and they got all of their future tech, and they're going to use it to conquer the world. Naturally. It still retains a lot of that 50s look, although there's some actually pretty nice stuff in here from time to time. Again, this is what kind of makes me think it's drawn by Gary Leach, who has some very nice style. While it does retain a 50s look, there's some nice figures in here. There's nice amounts of detail on every panel. It's good-looking stuff. And the deal with this particular story is that the Science Gestapo first lands in Cornwall, where Kid Miracleman happens to be, and they start laying waste to the area. So naturally, he transforms into Kid Miracleman. He starts punching out all the baddies. But because of their future tech, the hits don't really hurt them all that much. They get right back up again. And he's starting to get overwhelmed. He quickly goes to find his friend Dickie Dauntless. That's him there. He transforms into Young Miracleman. But even the two of them together, they're still having difficulties dealing with these guys. Meanwhile, Mickey Moran has heard about all sorts of crazy stuff going on in Cornwall. He transfers into Miracleman by saying the magic word Kimota, which is just atomic backwards. But it sounds good anyway. And they're able to knock out all of the Science Gestapo. From there, they have to move to all sorts of different areas on the planet, because the Science Gestapo aren't just landing in England, they're also landing in Rome, in Washington, in Russia. So they got to split up and deal with all those problems. And by the time they meet up again, the Science Gestapo in Cornwall have woken up, and they're laying waste to the place again. So this seems like kind of an unsolvable problem, until Miracleman comes up with a solution where him and Young Miracleman are basically just going to fly super fast into the future. I don't know how that makes sense, but sure. I assume this is like Christopher Reeve's Superman rules, leaving Kid Miracleman behind to deal with the Science Gestapo. So once they're in the future, Miracleman and Young Miracleman arrive at the launch site of the Science Gestapo just before they're about to head into the past. They destroy all the ships, knock out the leader here, Commandant Garer, and they turn him into the future authorities. They then travel back in time where Kid Miracleman was fighting with the bad guys, but all of a sudden all the bad guys disappeared, because Miracleman and Young Miracleman basically created a paradox where they never went back in time. But if they never went back in time, then Miracleman and Young Miracleman never would have traveled into the future to stop them. And if Miracleman and Young Miracleman never traveled into the future to stop them, then they would have gone back in time. It's very basic Star Trek rules, but we're not talking about that now. We're going to deal with the mechanics of that in the future. Anyway, everything's all fine at the end here. The Miracleman family gathers at the end, and Miracleman kind of explains things, but not very clearly, just clearly enough that you can close the book and not think about it anymore. And we end with the page that Alan Moore inserted with the slow zoom in on Miracleman's eye here, where Alan Moore quotes Nietzsche's "Thus spake Zarathustra," saying, "Behold, I teach you the Superman, he is this lightning, he is this madness." And it's like, well, that doesn't really reflect what I just read, but sure, yeah, no, absolutely, yeah, lightning and madness. And that's the first installment, or maybe even the first two installments, I think, of Miracleman. So some fun 50s style action, like if you've ever read Alan Moore's Supreme run, it's very much in that vein. It's interesting how this is kind of a template for a couple of books that Alan Moore would do later. Anyway, from there we move on to Chapter 2. This is the 1982 prologue. We've got a very different look now, and this is more in line with the look that the book is going to have going forward. So we're going to start out here with a couple of crooks. I think they've stolen this truck, and they're going to be using it in a planned heist to steal some plutonium later, and they're going to be selling this plutonium on the black market. Trevor here seems to have some misgivings. He's not, really into selling plutonium to be made into atom bombs. Steve doesn't seem to have that problem, though. From everything he's heard, atomic bombs are kind of awesome. We're not going to see any more of them for a while, but this is just kind of setting things up for future. From there, we're going to cut to Mike Moran, no longer Mickey, because, you can't be like a nearly 40-year-old dude going around being called Mickey. Nobody does that. And he's having a dream. This is a dream he has often, where he's a weird dude in a leotard who he knows is invincible, he knows he can fly, and he's in a situation where he's investigating some kind of space station with his two very flashy friends. And we can see here that the art is getting way more meticulous, which is, again, something that would catch up to Gary Leach later on. But the space station looks absolutely fantastic. There's some kind of limited color stuff going on here, but they're really able to come up with some interesting effects on the station itself. Anyway, in the dream, Mike and his friends are approaching the station, but Mike has a feeling that something's wrong, and he kind of hangs back a little bit while his friends go in to investigate. All of a sudden, the station seems to explode as an atomic bomb goes off. He can see his buddy, Dickie Dauntless. He thinks something bad is happening to him. First, he flickers a strobing Doppler image against the snow, and then he explodes. So the Doppler image thing is because he's basically two bodies in one. He's the kid who transforms into the superhero, and he's the superhero. And then the shockwave hits him, and he falls to Earth. Again, very different feel from how we started things out. This is getting very bleak very quickly. And then Mike wakes up screaming. It's kind of interesting to note historically, I guess, just how often Alan Moore's early work had an element of nuclear paranoia, which was still prevalent at the time. Not so much as in the 50s, but then again, this is a character that was born out of the 50s, so that also plays well. But you see that kind of nuclear fear in V for Vendetta, which was written around the same time, also a few years later in Watchmen. I'm not sure if it ever showed up in Swamp Thing. I certainly wouldn't be surprised, though. And I think it would take the Cold War ending before Alan Moore stopped using it as an element in his fiction. Again, just kind of an interesting thing to notice. So now we're going to get back to Mike Moran waking up from his nightmare. He wakes up his wife, Liz, but this is something that Liz has gotten used to because Mike has his dream fairly often. We see a little bit of their day-to-day routine, where Mike is kind of slow and apologetic and mumbles. He doesn't like the fact that his wife is kind of the breadwinner of the family. That shouldn't be her position. It's 1981. Liz thinks that's dumb, and Mike kind of leaves before an argument can start about it. He's on his way to work, where he works as a journalist, but he can't stop thinking about that dream and how he keeps having this dream. And he knows there was some kind of word that he used to say that would kind of make sense of all of this, only he can't remember what that word was. He's like, what is it? Kimono? Komodo? Krakatoa? Something like that. But he can't come up with it. So all he can do is go on to work, even though he's developing this splitting fucking headache. Again, splitting headaches are something that Mike is used to. They seem to happen fairly often. You'll notice that the lettering is actually really small, and the art itself is actually pretty condensed because these were originally all produced in a UK magazine format, so they actually used to be a fair bit larger. Anyway, he's on his way to the Larksmere Atomic Power Station, where a protest is going on. So this is the job that he's reporting on today. Finds his photographer. The photographer's like, you know what, you might want to talk to some of the kooks. That's probably pretty good for human interest type stories. But before Mike can figure out what kind of angle the story is going to take, a bunch of masked gunmen show up and take control of the crowd. And they're going to shuffle them all inside so they can start issuing their demands. Apparently, Gary Leach is a guy who liked to use a lot of photo reference when he was designing his characters. So, for instance, when we were talking about Liz here earlier, she apparently was patterned after Audrey Hepburn, while Mike here is designed after middle-aged Paul Newman. You can see it there. So once they have them inside, they start informing the crowd of what's going on using a bullhorn. And they tell them how they're going to be taking a whole bunch of plutonium isotopes. And they say the plutonium, easily enough to make a score of hydrogen bombs, will be auctioned amongst the world's terrorist organizations. And the reason they're telling everybody this is because they know a bunch of journalists are in the crowd, and they want this reported far and wide, I guess, so that they can get more terrorists to show up for their auction. We don't get a whole bunch of detail because these are very short installments that were originally published in Warrior. So kind of similar problems to what Barry Windsor-Smith was having on Weapon X, where he was trying to figure out how to make an 8-page story work. Only sometimes Alan Moore had even less time. Like some of these stories go only 5 or 6 pages. So while the hostages are being taken, and while the guy keeps yelling into the bullhorn, that headache of Mike's keeps getting worse and worse, to the point where he pretty much collapses. And we find out that these are the same guys that we saw in the prologue, at least a couple of them. Because the guy here who grabs Mike and has to, drag him outside is Steve, who was the guy in the truck earlier who was super excited about atomic bombs. And while Mike is getting dragged out, I guess he sees the sign for the installation. So we see backwards, Lake Smear Atomic Power Station, authorized personnel only. But, since it's backwards, all the words show up backwards, and we see atomic backwards. And that kind of jogs Mike's memory for a second. He goes, wait a minute, and says Komoda, and that does transform him into Miracleman. Get a big old crack of lightning. Steve here doesn't fare too well. He gets concussed, his eardrums get burst, he gets like 2nd-degree burns. He's just like tossed on the floor here. And we're left with Mike as Miracleman standing in the debris. And all the memories come flooding back about who he is. So this is a very interesting kind of update if you're looking at it through like a Captain Marvel kind of lens. We've got our terrorist situation, which is not a traditional, Captain Marvel superhero kind of situation. But that's the kind of situation that might happen in England in 1981, I guess. And this is what happens when a man transforms basically into a god amongst regular people. It's not a good deal for the regular people. So Steve's buddies hear the commotion outside. They come to see what's happening. They see this weird dude in a leotard who just keeps saying he's Miracleman. And the guy here, who might be Trevor from the beginning, we're not for sure, we don't get his name, but he starts to panic because he thinks that he's linked to the cops somehow. He thinks maybe he's SAS, because the SAS always show up in leotard. And he starts firing at Miracleman, but naturally bullets don't hurt Miracleman, they just bounce off. And Trevor kind of snaps a little bit at the sight. He's like hysterical laughing as he keeps firing at him, and nothing's happening. Miracleman responds by doing a big old thunderclap with his hands, which takes all the crooks out, leaving them for the police to pick up, naturally. And then Miracleman flies away triumphant. Not only did he save the day, but he's finally whole again after 20 years. And we get a big exultant shot of him flying up into space, yelling, "I'm Miracleman, I'm back." So that is where this chapter is going to end. I gotta think anybody who was reading this stuff at the time, there's got to be some pretty exciting stuff, because you're not really seeing a whole lot of this. There's not even a whole lot of superheroes in Warrior, really. This was meant to be the one outlier. Deathskin knew he needed a superhero in the comic, but I think it really is just the one. But still, this kind of postmodern breakdown of superheroes, this isn't something that usually happens too often. In the early 80s. These days, I think we've all seen it more than a couple of times. All right, so Miracleman, Book 1, Chapter 3. This is after the fact, and we're coming in on Mike Moran's house, where Liz has fallen asleep in front of the TV, and the TV is talking about some weird events that happened at the power plant earlier today. We get a little bit of an update on the state of the terrorists. It's not good. It says, although reports are yet to be confirmed, it appears that many of the terrorists are now in hospital suffering from severe concussion. One of the raiders, a man in his early 30s, is said to have 2nd-degree burns, and as yet these injuries are inexplicable. Bystanders apparently reported a man-shaped object flying into the sky, although authorities are basically ruling that out as mass hysteria. And then the report ends with Miracleman entering the home of Mike and Liz and waking Liz up. And, he still has all of Mike's memories. He's a little bit different when he's in this form. Liz doesn't recognize him at first. She's like, "What are you doing in my house?" And Miracleman's like, "Well, come on, Liz, it's me. It's Mike. Look at me, look at my eyes, listen to my voice." And, it's obviously not. Mike Moran is, he's a kind of a dumpy middle-aged man. But she can kind of recognize him in there somewhere. And, she's confused, but she grabs onto him, and he's able to kind of comfort her. Although, she can feel that he's, restraining himself, and he could crush her if he wanted to. So they're going to sit in the kitchen, and they're going to have a bit of a discussion, because Mike, or Miracleman, has quite a few things that he needs to go over now that he has all of his memories back. So in Chapter 3 here, we're going to get ourselves an origin story. It's a very interesting structure that Alan Moore's come up with here. It's very, intentional. Chapter 1 reintroduced the reader to Miracleman, present his current circumstances, and then transition him from, middle-aged, dumpy Mike Moran to Miracleman. No real explanation just yet. Now we're going to get the explanation. And then chapter 4 is when they're going to build off of that and start putting in place the building blocks for the story that Alan Moore is going to tell going forward. Like I said, it's very intentional. Which I mean, regular readers of Alan Moore wouldn't be surprised at by any means, but this is still very early in his career. Every once in a while at this time, he does still make the odd misstep. There's still the odd little awkwardness, occasionally. But it is something to realize just how good he was a writer, like right from the get-go. So, he's going to tell Liz about how he became Miracleman. And Liz is going to get these visions while he tells the story. So you start getting the impression early that, his powers aren't limited to just super strength and invulnerability and the ability to fly. There's something else going on here where they can have like a direct effect on people, although it's not explored very much just yet. But he tells her as a story about when he was just a young newspaper boy and all of a sudden he was confronted by this apparition that introduced itself as the astrophysicist Guntag Borghelm. Sorry, I had to get right up to read that. These letters are really small. And he's decided that this Mickey Moran kid, he's a good kid. He's so good that he should have superpowers. So it tells him about the word Komoda. Says if you say the word, you're going to turn into a superhero. And then he goes, okay, have fun with that. Bye. And then he leaves. And then Mickey never sees him again. And he says, I found I could fly, that I had tremendous strength, I was invulnerable to all harm, I was Miracleman. And he looks up at Liz and he's like, why are you laughing? And Liz is like, well, because the story's kind of stupid. You were just found as a boy by a futuristic astrophysicist and he gave you superpowers? And he's like, yeah, it does sound a little weird when you say it out loud like that, but I mean, I do have the superpowers. Like, look at me. And he goes continuing with the story. He tells him about his young friends, Kid Miracleman and Young Miracleman, and their secret identities, Johnny Bates and Dickie Dauntless. She laughs again at Dickie Dauntless. Why would anybody be called Dickie Dauntless? That's ridiculous. But he keeps pushing forward, telling him about how they had battles with the Firebug and Young Nasty Man and the freakish dwarf genius Dr. Gargunza. And he says how Dr. Gargunza always used to come up with schemes to, like some kind of evil scheme, and they would always thwart him. And never really seemed to be dangerous. Like Dr. Gargunza would always get put away and then he'd always escape and he'd have some scheme and somebody would be in danger of getting hurt, kind of, but then he'd get thwarted again. And it all just kind of seemed like some kind of game that they were all playing. The art here is pretty fucking great here, by the way, too. Like all throughout, I don't know much about Gary Leach outside of Miracleman, but the stuff he's doing on this, it's pretty impressive. And Liz is still, like, she's not taking this seriously. It's like, okay, obviously, you look very different from how you normally do. Sure. But you can't expect me to believe things like Young Nasty Man and Dickie Dauntless and the astrophysicist. Or, the Miracleman family. I mean, how come I've never heard of the Miracleman family? You think I would have. And Miracleman's like, well, I don't know. Maybe they hushed it up or something after what happened in 1963. And she's like, oh, yeah, what happened in 1963? Did a couple more Miracleman show up and you put together a football team? And that kind of sends Miracleman over the edge a little bit. And he's like, damn it, you're laughing at my life. And he smashes up the solid oak floor between them. And that kind of shuts Liz up because like, oh shit, well, at least he's got the strength anyway. So now he's going to tell her about what happened in 1963, which is the scenario that Mike Moran used to dream about all the time. So him and his buddies, Young Miracleman and Kid Miracleman, they fly up and they're investigating some space station that belonged to Dr. Gargunza. And while they were investigating, Miracleman hung back while his buddies went in to take a closer look. And then an A-bomb went off. And Miracleman didn't see what happened to Kid Miracleman. He did see Young Miracleman get fucking vaporized. And then he fell to Earth. And when he woke up, he didn't remember anything about the Miracleman family or Dr. Gargunza or any of it. So that kind of leaves him where he is today. Where, like I said before, he's finally whole again. He has, like, full awareness of his powers again. But he's still kind of haunted by the event that caused him to lose Miracleman for 20 years of his life. Then we're going to cut to an office somewhere where that report about what happened at the power plant is going on. And we got a shadowy figure here, thinking to himself, Miracleman, he's back. He's going to spoil everything, as he smashes a desk in front of him, just leaves it kind of like a smoking wreck in front of him. So, leaving us with a bit of a cliffhanger for the end of Chapter 3. So, now we're moving on to Chapter 4. So, this is where things are going to start getting ratcheted up. We start with Liz, who's waking up, the next day in bed. And she wakes up not next to Mike, she wakes up next to Miracleman. And she's remembering the night before when she slept with a god. because that's how he kind of appears to be. In addition to being, like invulnerable, super strength, all that kind of stuff, he's also got this presence to him that feels, like inhuman. His voice has more resonance. He's got like the sparkle effect to him a lot of the time. It's like a completely different experience. And she gets woken up by the phone. She goes and answers it, and they're asking for Mike. And she's like, oh, sure, yeah, let me go wake him up. And while she says that, big old flash comes from the bedroom with a Shrek. And Mike Moran, not Miracleman, comes out of the bedroom. Because the person at the other end of the line isn't asking for Miracleman, he's asking for Mike. So I got to assume that even Miracleman talking on the phone would sound quite a bit different. So he had to transform. It's an interesting little mechanic, just like a fun little moment. And it turns out the guy on the other end of the line is actually Kid Miracleman, which kind of blows Mike away. He thought he was dead. He didn't remember even seeing what happened to him. So this is Johnny Bates, and apparently Johnny doesn't have the same kind of problems Mike had, where he couldn't remember any of the Miracleman stuff. So once he saw Miracleman on the news, he had to reach out to him immediately. And invites him over to his office, and this is the office here, which apparently Johnny Bates owns. And we get our gray sky here, just a little bit kind of intimidating. And these days it turns out Johnny Bates is like a high-powered businessman. Owns his own technology company, worked up from just like kind of a small electronics boutique. And he explains what happened on board the space station from his perspective, which was that he went in to investigate the station, but immediately got the sense that something was wrong, tried to get as much distance from it as he could as soon as possible. Then the explosion went off and he fell to Earth. And it didn't block out his memory or anything, but what it did apparently was it cut off his access to the Miracleman powers. He was going back to just being Johnny Bates again. And he says, after 7 years of having this incredible life, all of a sudden that got taken away and he was back to being a regular person. And he had to figure out what to do with his life. So he built himself up to being like this big time CEO. And he has to step away for a moment to deal with some business matters. While he goes, Mike and Liz are talking. And Mike asks her, so what do you think of him? And Liz is like, well, what do you think I think? He's obviously magnetic, he's got an aura about him. And he's quite sexy in a sinister kind of way, which is an odd way to describe him, but you can see it here. And she's like, what did you think about him? Has he changed a lot since you knew him last? And Mike has to say, yeah, he has. He's changed a lot. This is not the kid he knew growing up. And that storm keeps coming in and kind of closing in on the building they're in. And let's just try to get rid of spoilers for a second, just for a second. So after their initial meeting, Mike and Johnny are going to have a little bit of a talk outside on the balcony. And Mike tells Johnny, look, I listened to your story, rags to riches, redemption through honest toil. It's a great story. I really wanted to believe it. But then halfway through your story, I got to thinking, what if he's lying? And I tried to let go of it, but it wouldn't go away. I'm thinking, what if he didn't lose his powers? What if he survived that blast that took out me and Dickie and was still Kid Miracleman? And we get this great kind of foreboding buildup as that storm keeps closing in. We get the eyes shining in the darkness here as Mike keeps talking, and they're all heavily dramatically shadowed. And Johnny stays silent while Mike keeps talking. He's like, I tried to imagine what it would feel like to be 16 years old and the most powerful creature on the face of the planet, and to be answerable to no one. You could do anything, John. You never need to turn back to dull, weak, human Johnny Bates ever again. Oh, sure, you could take his name, his identity, but you could stay as Kid Miracleman forever. You could have it all. Money, prestige, fame. You could sever all your links with humanity. You could become remorseless, unstoppable, and totally corrupt. So is that it, John? Is that what happened? You're still Kid Miracleman, aren't you? He says, I can tell by your voice, by the way you stand. You're not human, John. I can feel it. And John kind of tries to talk his way out of it. He's like, look, you're imagining things. You're being paranoid. You see that, right? And Mike starts to agree with him for a second. He's like, oh, maybe you're right. And then he realizes, wait a minute, are you doing something? Are you changing my mind for me? So again, kind of some subtle, maybe telepathy or something, or power suggestion, that kind of thing. So he kind of has a hold on Mike, but that's when Liz comes back in and kind of breaks it for a second. And, Mike has possession of his faculties for a moment, and he shoves John off the balcony, which naturally terrifies Liz. She's like, what the hell just happened? But then John rises up, flying in the air, lightning crackling off him, because he's not John. He's Kid Miracleman. And he's not a hero anymore. He's completely corrupted and absolutely all-powerful, at least as far as people are concerned. And that's where this chapter ends, but that's a hell of an ending, eh? Him rising up. Some nice stuff going on with the color here, too, with the color hold. That's great looking stuff. And we just get some, like, facts about the history of Marvelman. Oh, and what else Eclipse is publishing? Like Zot. But yeah, that's Miracleman #1. It's actually a really good introduction. It's interesting because these were all, like separate anthologized serials that were all combined into one. It wouldn't necessarily make for a cohesive volume, but it does. It's a pretty impressive start. And I mean, Eclipse at this time, they're a pretty small publisher. We've taken a look at a couple of their books, like Zot, like Mr. Monster. They also put out the Destroy comic, which I do want to look at sometime. Like, they definitely put out some quality stuff, but it was pretty small time. And yeah, when this is put out, Alan Moore is on Swamp Thing. He's been working there for just over a year, I think. So that reputation of his is starting to grow pretty fast. But it would still be another year or so until Watchmen, and then that's when he kind of blows up. And I think at that time, anybody who hadn't read Swamp Thing was going back and trying to find some of those old back issues. And then word started to get out that there was another comic that was out there that predated his Swamp Thing work, and they started looking for this Miracleman stuff. So, I mean, I can't find hard numbers, but I don't think these Eclipse comics would have had, like, large circulations. Bigger than, like, actual small press, like indie guys, but still smaller than anything mainstream. Probably in the neighborhood of, like, maybe between 20 and 40,000 copies. And it would gain steam as the series went on because Alan Moore's name would start getting bigger and bigger. Until we get to the climax around issue 15, which pays off the stuff we were setting up at the end here with Kid Miracleman, in probably the most horrifying superhero battle up until that point. That was the one I always wanted to have a copy of. I could never find a copy for a reasonable price, even back in the day. I was able to get a few of the early issues of Miracleman, at least, like, for not very much at all. But I don't think anybody had a copy of Miracleman #15 when I was looking. And these days, like, good luck trying to get a copy for less than $100. But, if somebody hasn't read Miracleman, and they like Alan Moore's stuff, or, they've read deconstructed superhero stuff, and they'd like to see a bit more, or like see where that kind of started getting popularized, I think they should definitely check out Miracleman. Like I said, it's kind of setting the foundation for what he would later look into more with things like Watchmen. There's the whole deconstruction element. A lot of what Alan Moore was doing with Miracleman himself, he would later do with Dr. Manhattan. The element of superheroes dealing with not just, like run-of-the-mill crime-fighting stuff, but actually tackling, like, global problems. All that foundation gets laid down in Miracleman. It's an excellent book. It still holds up extremely well. I'll see if I can get a few more issues. Maybe we can go through some of them sometime. I think that would be a good time. But for this one anyway, that is going to do it. So thanks very much for watching, guys. If you like this video, please hit the like button. Helps with the algorithm stuff. Hit subscribe to see more. If you're watching on mobile, there's a hype button you can hit, and that'll help this get seen by more people. If you want to help the channel out, you can look in the description and find my link tree. Follow that to my Patreon and subscribe there. That'll give you access to everything I do. So all sorts of videos, all sorts of Blood Force comics. You can also follow me on Instagram and DM me there for commissions. But yeah, that'll do it. Thanks again for watching, guys. I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.